Hey, you're tuned to Resilience Radio. This is an episode with Rob Mermin, mime actor, and various other things that you'll hear about. My name's Irvin Eisenberg, show host and owner of Resilience Occupational Therapy. The opinions on this show are not necessarily shared by me. I really like to showcase a variety of different perspectives. And additionally, none of it's meant to be medically diagnostic or prescriptive. Today we have Rob Mermin. Great to have you on.
Good to be here. I look forward to our discussion.
So can you just start off telling me what's your profession? What do you do?
Well, I was trained as a mime. My teacher was the French mime Marcel Marceau. I started training with him when I was 19, and he became my mentor for the rest of my life, the next 40 years. But I didn't make a career just as a mime. I ran off to join the European circus and worked as a clown for a couple of decades, traveling around in various circuses. And then I came home to Vermont and founded my own little circus, Circus Smirkus. So I've had a career in mime and theater and circus. It was about 8 years ago I was diagnosed with Parkinson's. And it started with a sense, I'm very aware of movement and control of movement through my training. So I was very aware when I started to move slower than usual. And my left side, my left arm, and my left hand were not as coordinated as usual. I'm a juggler, so the hands have to work in coordination equally. And I realized that my left hand wasn't throwing a ball as accurately as my right hand. And I was becoming more rigid. I wouldn't say stiff. I mean, when you overuse your muscles and you're stiff, that's one thing. But rigidity in Parkinson's, it comes from the inside somehow through the nervous system. And I couldn't control that rigidity. So that's when I went to my doctor, and he sent me to a neurologist. And within 10 minutes, the neurologist said, "I'm sorry, I'm afraid you've got Parkinson's." I mean, she could tell just like that. And I didn't know much about Parkinson's at the time, so I started to do my research, of course, and reading about it made a lot of sense for my own experience.
So you've worked with a lot of people with Parkinson's, and we'll get more into that in a moment. But I was wondering if you could, from both your personal experience and from your observations and others, if you could for guests define what Parkinson's is and sort of how it's experienced.
Parkinson's is a neurological disease. I mean, they call it Parkinson's disease, PD, but in working with a lot of other Parkinson's patients, we decided not to call it Parkinson's disease because we didn't like the word disease. As when you first get diagnosed with something like Parkinson's, the doctors tell you a couple of things. First, they say it's incurable and it's progressive and your nervous system deteriorates. I mean, that's all negative sounding stuff. And in my reading and research about Parkinson's, which is the neurotransmitters that transmit dopamine, those cells are being destroyed in the brain, and that's what causes Parkinson's symptoms. And it is a progressive disease, but after 8 years, I find that I'm still pretty much managing the symptoms compared to other people with Parkinson's that I've seen and worked with. And so I start to wonder, what is it that I've been doing or my training that has helped me manage the symptoms? And even my neurologist said, it's probably has to do with my training in mime, which is all about analyzing movement and control of movement.
So what types of movements practices have for mime that you do feel like have been the most helpful in setting you up for a less impactful Parkinson's experience?
I came up with 5 or 6 elements of the art of mime that I figured are important for working with Parkinson's. And I started to teach a weekly class here in Montpelier for people with Parkinson's. And the class, for a couple of years, every week was an experimentation on things that I do and I have done, and could it help other people as well as myself. The first element or principle of mime, I would call awareness. And that's awareness if I'm moving wrong, if something is wrong with my body or with my movements, first I need to be aware of that. I mean, I remember in the mime class, Parkinson's mime class, there's one fellow who was very stooped over. His posture was very bad. His neck was forward and his shoulders were curved forward. And at the beginning of the class, I said, well, can you stand up straighter, stand with better posture? And he said, I am. And he didn't realize he had such bad posture, if he wasn't looking at a mirror. So first of all, it's becoming aware of how you're moving correctly or incorrectly. And then once you become aware of that, then observe it almost objectively. One of the easy noticeable symptoms in Parkinson's in the early stages, and this happened with me, was my neurologist had me walk down the hall as naturally as I could and come back. And one of my arms was not swinging. My left arm was not swinging as much as my right arm. I had not noticed that until she mentioned it. And sure enough, it was my left side that was affecting me more with the Parkinson's. But as soon as she mentioned it, I became aware that my left arm wasn't swinging as much. So I walked down the hallway and I observed that it wasn't swinging. So then I purposely started to make it swing.
So you're someone who's made at least part of your profession out of having that self-observation, that proprioceptive experience. I imagine that comes a lot easier for you than your students who already have Parkinson's disease or the Parkinson's.
Yeah.
How do you feel that? How does that translate for someone who's already having neurological challenges?
Well, it took me a while to realize that the other people were not observing their movements as well as I do. And that's because of the mime training. So then I started to teach them principles of mime and really breaking down and analyzing everyday movements. For example, if you're reaching for a glass of water, if you have Parkinson's tremor, even reaching for a glass of water and picking up the glass could be very difficult. You don't want to spill the glass or tip it over if you have tremors in your hand. So in mime, first we imagine an invisible glass of water in front of you, project that imagery in front of you, and then one movement at a time, you raise your elbow, raise your wrist, move your arm towards the glass. The palm of your hand touches the outside of the glass. Your hand then takes the shape of the glass. Then you pick it up. And as you pick up a glass, is your elbow down? Is your elbow up as you drink? So those are all things that in mime, we analyze and practice first by doing the action in real life. So I remember after mime class every day with Marcel Marceau, I would go home to my apartment and I would practice with real objects. How do I reach for a real glass of water? How does my arm move through space? How do I lift it up and bring it towards me? And so I would analyze how I do the real activity. Then I would do it in mime without the real object. And by doing it in mime, I get the visualization kind of inherent in my body. My body muscles start to understand how to do it by doing it in mime first with the visualization technique and imagery. And once I could correctly do it in mime after analyzing the movement, then the Parkinson's class, I would try to do things with the real objects. So, for example, another example would be in a mime class in the winter, everybody comes to the class and they're taking off their coats and hanging them up on hangers. And so right away, I would say, okay, there's an exercise for us. How are you taking your jacket off? Let's analyze that. And how do you put a jacket on? One arm at a time. How are you doing that if you have bad posture and you have tremor or rigidity because of Parkinson's? Let's analyze how we do it with the real object, then put the object down. Let's do it in mime. So visually, your body starts to understand the image of doing that action. And then again, let's do it with the real object, with the real jacket. And hopefully your body memory from the visualization technique will ease the real movement. So it helps the people with Parkinson's with their daily activity.
So a lot of OTs and PTs who work with people with Parkinson's are familiar with the Big and Loud program, and the idea is to that with Parkinson's movements and be that movements of the voice or movements of the body tend to get smaller. One of the signs of Parkinson's sometimes can be people's handwriting starts to get really, really small and tight, or the festering gait as you approach a threshold as you're walking, your steps start to get shorter and shorter until it can get to the point of a freeze.
Destination.
Yeah. So to me, it seems like there's getting people to overly fixate on what they're doing, on the destination and what they're doing, sometimes can make the movements smaller and more symptomatic. I'm curious how, with this intentionality, you keep them. I mean, the theory is to make them bigger and sort of more exaggerated. But when you're analyzing it in the detail that you are, how do you keep from that shrinking quality?
Well, the exaggeration of movements is one of the things that we practice. For example, one of the fun exercises that I would do, I would have the folks raise their one index finger in the air, and then imagine writing their name in space, either printing or in script, but write their name in small letters, just using your finger. So you write in space the letters of your name. And then I say, okay, let's do it, but twice as large now. So we would do that same imagery, but twice as large. And then I would say, okay, let's do it with your left hand, your left finger, write your name and see how that goes. And that sets something off in their brain too, because it's a little harder with your offhand. And then I would say, okay, let's do that same letter, but larger. Now let's make it huge, make it several feet in the air as you're writing your name in space. So suddenly they start to appreciate what is small and what is large. And again, it's body recognition and muscle memory that starts to allow them to make the larger gestures. Which brings up the idea of gesture. About 1 year into teaching this weekly class for Parkinson's Mime, I started to realize that their gestures were very small. They're normal daily gestures. And movements in Parkinson's do start to freeze up. And so we would start off the class going around the circle with people saying how they were doing, how this past week was, and just checking in. And that started to become an exercise. Like there's one fellow one time started to say, well, this past week, my grandchildren came over and they were running around and throwing things in the air, and he was not moving as he was saying this. His hands were in his lap. So I said, okay, tell me that exact same story, but gesture. And he said, you mean I wasn't gesturing? I said, no, you were not. So then we started to practice gesture. I said, your grandchildren came over? So we had him motion his arms like coming over towards him. And I said, and they were throwing things around. So as you say, throwing things around, show me with your arms throwing around. And so suddenly the idea of storytelling became a gesture exercise. And, then my homework for them that day was, okay, go back home tonight over dinner. If you're sitting with your wife and you're having a conversation, start gesturing and exaggerated gesturing as you're talking and see if she notices it. Because if with Parkinson's, if you exaggerate your gestures, it actually looks like normal gesturing. So we have to exaggerate our movements. And you mentioned the Big and Loud program, which I took the big program to see what it was all about. And I liked it a lot. But what came out of that, again, was a sense of the importance of imagery. For example, one of the exercises was sitting in a chair and with one arm, moving your arm behind you and then sweeping it in front of you across your body to the other side and up in the air. And then back again and sweep it up again to the other side. And immediately I said, well, that's like bowling, like having a bowling ball in your hand and bowling. And the PT said, yeah, why don't we exaggerate that and make it with real? So I reach for a bowling ball and I get the image in my hand of sweeping the bowling ball back behind me, reaching forward and throwing the bowling ball and then following through with the movement. So it became a bowling exercise. There was another one where we brought both hands to the side and clapped, then brought both hands to the other side of my body and clapped, then clap on a diagonal. And it was a good stretching exercise, but for me, the image was killing mosquitoes. So we turned that into a mosquito exercise where we would reach high up to clap the mosquito and way down and then different sides. So suddenly it became an exercise of imagery. And because of that, it became fun. And that's the kind of thing we were doing in a class. Any daily movements or any exercise that you're doing, turn it into an imagery exercise. And suddenly it felt like the muscles were learning something neurologically.
So this reminds me of occupational therapy versus physical therapy. The line between those two is often hard to define. I always sort of say it depends on the setting and often depends on how insurance wants to look at it. But OT in its basic premise is occupation being meaningful activity. And if an activity isn't meaningful to someone, be it the goal of what they're trying to do isn't something that's meaningful to them, or the means of getting there, the type of exercise they're doing for that goal isn't meaningful, then it's not really occupational therapy. So it's somebody who wants to get better at using their hands for a particular activity. You do that activity as much as you can, and you do other similar meaningful activities. So you might have people knitting or playing poker or doing meaningful things. And what I really love about what you're talking about is here are these exercises that are sort of scientifically studied to be shown as useful, but it's more engaging and more probably more useful to have a clear image of something. And even if it's not a practical image in the sense of maybe there's no mosquitoes in the room or you actually don't really want to go bowling, it's still fun. And play is one of the occupations. That's a meaningful activity even in and of itself. So I really love how, as an OT, I really love how you've taken the very biomechanical approach, and you've made it more meaningful and more fun.
Well, yeah, a lot of physical therapists and occupational therapists, and worked with some of them to discover exactly what you're talking about. And I remember when I had a bad lower back and herniated disc, and it became really hard to move. You have any kind of injury, breaking a bone or anything else, you have to adjust how you move. So an occupational therapist came to me and said, it looks like you're having trouble getting into the car and out of the car. So let's practice how to make your movements easier getting in and out of the car, how you swivel in the seat and how you get up. Do you get up moving your head forward first? Do you lean from the waist? This is all good, practical stuff. And I talked with the OT about that kind of analysis of movement, again, which is what we do in Mime. So I worked with her about visualizing first how I wanted to move more economically. And I would visualize, as I sat behind the driver's wheel, in the parked car, I would visualize, how do I want to move in the most economical way? So, I was starting just letting go of the steering wheel, bringing my elbows down, turning my head, turning my chest, swivel with my knees. So it was a lot of fun working with her, because we would apply the Mime techniques to the OT techniques. And that's what I started to do with the Parkinson's Mime class. I've worked with OT, I've worked with the PT, I've worked with neurologists. I've done the big program. I've done the Parkinson's boxing program. I've done the Dance for Parkinson's program. I wanted to explore all these methodologies to see what works. And, whatever works for anybody, that's what you should be doing. With the dance, I found the dance program a lot of fun for just straight and dance movements. The boxing I found a lot of fun because it was just pure athletics, and it was just great to be sweating and pushing the body that way. But what I was lacking in those programs was the analysis of the movement and the imagery that's so important in Mime. And so in the PD Mime class, we would analyze sports in Mime. How does a baseball batter swing a bat? How does a pitcher pitch a baseball? What are the moves? What are the 6 moves of pitching a baseball or a bowling ball? So we would practice all these sports in Mime. Here, I found a quote in a neurology book, which applies to what I'm saying here. It's about motor imagery, and it says, there's compelling evidence that motor imagery, or visualizing certain movements in the mind's eye, can also enhance the execution of learned skills. Thus, imagined movements appear to be equivalent to those that are actually performed, and going through the motions mentally, same kind of neural plastic changes in the brain. It brings in the whole notion of neuroplasticity, which has become a common term, how the brain can adjust and adapt to situations.
It's the mirror neurons in the brain, which I think are pretty unique to primates, is my understanding. I think that it's for those like myself who are comfortable with evolution as a model of looking at the world. It's if you're up in the trees and you do a misstep or a misreach, you're going to fall. So you want to learn from the other monkeys, is the way I think of it. So the ability to actually watch another monkey, another primate, in the trees, then wires your brain as if you have done it yourself, or thinking about how am I going to get up there, and planning that out is how I think of as the neuroplasticity, or the mirror neurons, which then shape your brain in doing it. And in some pain conditions, people actually, it's the very act of thinking about doing something can hurt, because it fires the brain that way. So that's like people who have phantom limb pain and such, just seeing someone else move their foot can actually cause physical pain in their brain. So I find the imagery to be, on a number of levels, not just looking at Parkinson's, to be a very useful and sort of a potent practice, and sometimes could be painful if not approached properly even. Do you find that the mime, your experience with mime, your personal experience in the class you've done is working with Parkinson's. I tend to think about resilience in general. How do you feel like mime, beyond the specific scope of Parkinson's, builds resilience for possibly other neurological conditions or other conditions that people might be challenges people might have? Where do you see the role of mime in that?
Mime, I'm sure, is helpful not just for Parkinson's, but for other neurological dysfunctions and motor dysfunction. I think of Marcel Marceau's definition of mime. He was a very good speaker. Once Marceau started talking, it was hard to get him to stop, and he would talk in imagery and metaphor. He described mime once to me. He said, the art of mime is the identification, the essence of all things that surround us, nature, objects, space, and the portrayal of human thought and emotion through silent physical expression. That's a mouthful. But for me, the key word there is identification, the identification with the essence of all things. So as my example, he would say, reach for an invisible apple and take a bite out of it. And it's easy to do that in mime, in pantomime, but he said, no. You have to make it real. So go deeper and identify with the essence of that apple. So as you're reaching for that invisible apple, get in your mind the image of an apple orchard and a farmer climbing a ladder to pick apples and putting them in a basket, and taking a basket of apples into the kitchen and cutting them up and putting it into a pie and baking it in the oven, and taking out the pie, and you smell the juice of the apples, and you take a bite of this apple pie that's just delicious. And all of this imagery goes into your head in one split second as you reach for that imaginary apple. So that when you take a bite out of that mime apple, it's a lot more real. And for the people in the audience watching you, they get the sense of that appleness and the juice and the smell of apple pie. So you identify in your mind with the imagery of the essence of that object. And that's, for me, an important way to think about how you move through the world, whether you have Parkinson's or not. How do you identify with the objects that you encounter in everyday life? With the shoes that you put on. You think about the actual shoe as you're putting it on. What the shoe goes through in the daily life of being on your foot. So mime really taught me how to observe the world and how to move through the world. Be way beyond the idea of performing. Marcel Marceau gave me a sense of seeing the world through metaphors. And I think that's an important reason why I love the art of mime.
And I think about the the apple and the metaphors you're talking about, it almost becomes archetypal. Like it's not just a shoe, it's every shoe. Or it's not just an apple, it's everything that could be done with an apple.
There's another principle of Parkinson's that I came across in my research, and I was talking with my neurologist about it, and it's a known term, but very little research. And I wonder if you're aware of anything to do with the idea of paradoxical kinesia. Have you heard that?
I think I have heard the term, and I'm it sounds like you're much more well researched on it, so I'm going to hear what you're.
Yeah, I borrowed a neurology textbook from my neurologist, which I understood just a fraction of it, but I came across the term paradoxical kinesia. Just the name fascinated me, and it's an intriguing phenomenon when an individual with a motor dysfunction like Parkinson's and has difficulty moving suddenly, for whatever reason, can, for a short period of time, move perfectly well. One of the big examples that you can see online is, I think it was in Scandinavia somewhere, where these nurses are helping a gentleman who has very, very bad Parkinson's, tremors, rigidity, bad posture. It was hard for him to even walk. He needed two people on either side of him to help him take steps forward. And they went outside to a parking lot and put him on a bicycle. And as soon as he got on the bicycle, he's riding that bicycle by himself, sitting up perfectly well, riding between obstacles all around the parking lot, coming back to the nurses. He gets off the bicycle and boom, he can hardly walk again. Paradoxical kinesia.
I've heard of it in various circumstances. I've seen videos of a similar thing, or a video where they put on ballroom dancing, and eventually the person who had been helping the man in his walker, who had the festering gait and was just having a lot of trouble, pushed the walker aside and started dancing around, clearly leading his caregiver in the activity, and then went back to his walker. And musical, of course, there's plenty of musical examples. You putting a Parkinson's piano player in front of the piano, and suddenly they can do it. It makes me wonder. You described this sort of intense awareness and building awareness of your activities, but a lot of these activities seem like they're things that are so enrooted in you that it's like you're going on automatic on something you've done before. So I guess what I'm curious about is that combination between sort of hyper intentionality and defaulting to an old passion or love that you go automatic on, and what's that rub, and in like what's effective with Parkinson's.
Yeah, I've found that when I play any kind of sports that I like, whether it's ping pong or playing catch with a baseball or tennis, I find that my Parkinson's almost disappears. I'm not thinking about it because I'm involved at the moment with that sports, throwing a ball or catching a ball that's coming towards me. And again, I wonder what is there about the body's intelligence that seems at times to bypass any neural damage, any damaged pathways in my body that has given me Parkinson's. What is it about the body's intelligence that knows what to do in these examples of paradoxical kinesia? So in the Mime class, I was trying to focus on that to see if there's a way we can intentionally trigger the what I'm calling the PKI, the Paradoxical Kinesia Impulse. Why not find a way to trigger it intentionally to manage our Parkinson's symptoms?
So there's two models of looking at the brain. One is the individual connection of neurons, which is sort of the micro level of how much impulse from one neuron does it take to have the next one in sequence fire.
Mhm.
And then there's the other model, which is the overall like electrical impulses across the brain and the sort of the electromagnetic fields taking place in the brain. And I feel like there's something about almost getting really small where it seems like the hang-up might be in Parkinson's, and I'm not positive on this, versus the gross experience in the brain, that the brain sort of knows how to do individual impulses, which is, and there might be misfires, but it also has like the big highways, the big sort of pre-programmed experiences. And that's sort of how I'm imagining it. I don't know if the neurology is correct in that experience. But
Yeah, I don't know about that either. You bring the idea of, highways and roads. I mean, we live in Vermont, and we're very soon coming to mud season. So if we know that if there's this dirt road that's going to be full of ruts and muddy, a dysfunctional road, then ahead of time we'll take a different road that we know is going to be clear. So maybe that's what's happening. If we have with Parkinson's, if we have neural pathways that are damaged with certain activities, maybe the brain says, okay, that's a damaged pathway, so I'm going to do a detour and take a healthy neural pathway. And how can we learn to do that on purpose?
It seems like almost focusing on the task and the destination versus all the individual roads and steps getting there. That if we maybe I'm I'm brainstorming here, but I'm thinking about that if you break it down too micro, then it feels like it's harder to accomplish. Like if someone's approaching the door, they tend to have more trouble getting there. But if they're looking past the door, my experience is getting people to focus past the door or to have some music or rhythm to what they're doing. Suddenly they're able to. Their steps are not getting smaller as they approach the door because it's not about the door.
Yeah, that's good. There's a similar example from my Parkinson's mime class. There's a fellow who had what they call freezing, right? Where it happens a lot, especially when they approach a doorway, and they would freeze. And mentally, they want to move forward, but their body won't take a step past that doorway. And I think what you're saying is, to look past it and imagine past it is very important. It's a key way to get around it. Another way they say is, well, don't try to take a step forward because your foot won't go forward. So step back or step to the side first and then go forward. That might work with some people. With this one guy, with Charlie, I had been showing the class how to do an invisible mime wall, how to create a wall in front of you using imagery and then your hands and then isolation of parts of your body to create the real image of a wall in front of you. So he said, if I come to a doorway and I freeze, can I imagine opening an imaginary door? And I said, yeah, go for it. And next time he came to class, he said, it worked. When he froze in front of a doorway, he imagined and did in mime with his hands a mime wall. Then he took hold of an imaginary handle on the door and pushed the mime door open, and he was able to walk right through.
Wow, he sort of created a metaphor for the boundary he had and pushed, and so they could manage it and push past it.
Yes, it was perfect use of mime and imagery, which is what I was hoping for.
Wow.
There's another thing, we in the class we did a lot of circus games. I was teaching them how to juggle and how to do magic tricks, rope tricks, and tricks with cards, because it's all about manipulation as well as using your brain. And one of the exercises was balancing objects. So I handed out peacock feathers to everybody. So when you put your hand out flat, your palm up, and you balance the peacock feather on the palm of your hand, it's a couple of feet high. And if you look at the bottom of the peacock feather, you'll lose the balance. But if you focus at the top of the feather and move your hand under it to keep it straight up and down, it's a lot easier. So they were having a lot of fun balancing that peacock feather. Well, there was one elderly lady who had really, really bad tremor and dyskinesia. She was moving a lot, uncontrolled, and her hand was really tremoring a lot. And I said to her when I gave her the peacock feather, well, you could grab hold on the bottom, if that's easy, because that's easier for you to hold on to it. But she put out her hand flat with her palm up, and she was shaking. And I placed the peacock feather onto her hand, and I said, focus at the top. So she focused to the top of the feather, and her hand, she didn't realize it, but her hand started to slowly stop tremoring. And she was balancing that peacock feather, focusing at the top of it to keep that in one place. And I was just smiling, because there she was. She overcame the tremor of her hand briefly, like paradoxical kinesia, without realizing she was doing that. It was because of her intentional focus on the peacock feather. Another instance of that was with the juggling that we were doing. Everybody had, I gave everybody a tennis ball. And I said, okay, walk across the studio to the other wall as you're tossing the tennis ball from one hand to the other. And as they were doing that, many of them who had very bad walking, they couldn't walk straight, they had dyskinesia, whatever, found it a lot easier to walk in a straight line as they were throwing this tennis ball from one hand to the other with each step, or bouncing it in front of them and catching it with each step. And again, there's what's going on. What is it that makes that use of a tennis ball suddenly help manage their symptoms? Something's going on neurologically. I love it. So we started to play more games and games with objects in the class. And not only was it a lot of fun, but and you mentioned earlier the aspect of fun, and a lot of people in the class, they would say afterwards, Rob, the one thing that we got out of your class was we learned how to play again.
I've been thinking about doing a movement class myself, and I've been thinking about what I would call it and what its goals would be. And my working title right now is Adults at Play. And a big caution yield sign with adult figures doing ridiculous things.
Right, wearing construction helmets.
So it's and within the OT world, there's all these categories of occupation. So there's your actual work, there's education, there's your basic activities of daily living, which is your showering and your bathing and your dressing and your toileting. So there's all these different categories, and then there's two categories that are presented as separate. One is play and the other is leisure. Play is considered, some refer to as the spontaneous thing that children are supposed to do. And leisure is might be fishing. You might not love every aspect of fishing. It might not all be spontaneous and love every aspect of it, but you're studying fishing and you might not enjoy putting the worm on the hook, but it's part of the whole process and you enjoy fishing. So often some OTs present as, well, leisure is for adults, a sophisticated activity, and play is that thing for children. And I'm like, well, no, spontaneous movement and joy without it having to be sort of this rigid adult activity is so important, I feel like, to everyone. And that's something that if anyone leaves my sessions, I want them to be able to find more joy in play within their work, whatever that is.
That's excellent. I hope you do that class. Anytime I would go visit my neurologist and go to his office, the office is a typical doctor's office. The walls are white. There might be a frame of some PhD certificate on the wall and a computer, and that's it. And I started to bring in toys. I said, Doc, look at this toy. Look how this is important for manipulation of my fingers using this fun toy. And I said, you need to have a shelf that has a series of these toys. So when people with Parkinson's come for their checkup, instead of just having them do the usual exercise, with their hands, have them play with this toy and see if they're getting better with it.
I work at a nursing home. I'm doing OT at a nursing home, and it's a very simple activity, but if you throw a balloon or a ball at almost anyone, except for a couple of more crotchety guys who it's just so much part of their identity that they're not going to enjoy themselves that it would be sort of it would be too much of a stretch for them to crack a smile, kind of thing. But that's the rare exception. Most everyone will grab the ball and throw it back, or hit the balloon back to you and grin while doing it. And people who, for the various neurological problems, might not be doing much of anything and having trouble reaching to do anything, you throw them a balloon and they're gonna reach and try to hit that balloon. They might miss, but they're going for it, and it's it's playful and fun, and one of my favorite activities that both feels like one of those silly things that how can I be calling this skilled therapy, is I just get a group of people. With COVID, I haven't been able to do this in a while because we don't get the residents this close together right now. Group of people, and then just have them throwing a ball back and forth. And each one's maybe got their own goal that we're working on in initiation. But if someone's got a Parkinsonian freeze and they're having trouble throwing it, everyone's cheering them on and counting with them to try to get them to throw the ball. And it's just a very simple throw the ball activity. Now we're talking about much more advanced condition, progression of the disease than the people coming into the senior center. But it's the same concepts seem to be there.
Well, yeah, I in the Mime class at the senior center, we had all kinds of symptoms and disabilities with people. A couple of them in wheelchairs who had a hard time even picking up a ball. But like you say, you present something in a fun way, and according to your ability at any level, you could have fun with any activity. And having fun and play is an important part of anybody's daily life. I remember we were practicing the movements of fencing, as if with a sword, where you lunge forward, but the trunk of your body stays straight, but one knee goes forward and one arm goes out straight, like you're holding a sword. So we practiced those steps, and then I told the class how I use that movement sometimes in daily life is when I go to the refrigerator and I open the refrigerator door, but I don't go right up close to take something out of the refrigerator shelf. I stand a couple of feet away from the front. So as I open up the door, I'm a couple of feet away and I lunge forward like I'm sword fighting to reach for something and pick up a piece of food to take it out of the refrigerator, as if I was, I turn it into an exercise, getting something out of the refrigerator. People started to do that at home and realizing that any daily activity, the simplest activity, like taking food from the refrigerator, you can turn into a practice exercise and have fun with it as a movement exercise.
Yeah. So there's a couple things I wanted to discuss before we went off. I feel like I'd be remiss for one, I told someone that I was interviewing a mime and they just started laughing. And I realized it didn't occur to me how funny that sounded. Um, but with that in mind, we've been talking about movement, which is your specialty, but we haven't been talking about speech at all, and which is another type of movement. And you, in talking to you, I'm not hearing the sort of the shrinking of sound that people have, where their voice gets quieter and their mouth structure gets smaller. Do you feel that your mime training has helped you be able to maintain the loud aspect of sort of big and loud and voice as well, or have you not been as affected in voice? What's your personal experience there?
Well, I haven't been affected very much with my voice, but I know what you're talking about. A lot of the people I know with Parkinson's, their voice has gotten so soft. And I think, again, they don't realize that their voice has gotten soft. So they have to go to, the voice class. I don't know why my symptoms have not developed in that way yet, and I hope I can hold it off a lot longer. So what I've done in the class with people is going back to the idea of gesture when you talk. And when people normally talk to each other on the street, they do have some kind of gesture, natural gesture going on. So I said, anytime you're speaking to someone, think of the gesture, and every time you're making a gesture, raise your voice higher. So I was trying to attach the voice practice with the movement gesture, because a gesture is a natural action. It's not fake. The same thing with the voice. So I was trying to tie those two together and see if that would be helpful for people.
And that seemed to work for people, for some of them at least?
For some of them, yeah. Again, going back to this fellow who was telling a story about how his week has gone. If his voice started to get soft, I would have him gesture more. And that set off a remembrance of, oh yeah, I have to speak louder too. And then at one point, as he was telling the story about his grandchildren coming to visit him and throwing things around in the living room, his voice was louder, but his gestures froze. His hands froze in midair as he was remembering and speaking about the experience of his grandchildren. And he didn't realize that his hands had frozen in the air. So as he was talking to me, I started to gesture silently, and he saw what I was doing. So then he unfroze his gestures. It's complicated, isn't it, for a lot of people who have, these symptoms. But trying to combine the gesture and the voice might work for some people. I've never taken a voice class for Parkinson's, so I don't know how they work.
Okay, so that sounds like a neat practice for. So most people don't end up getting Parkinson's, and if they do, they don't necessarily know they're going to in advance. But everyone, if they're lucky, will be aging at some point. Everyone is aging, would be another way to say that. Do you have any advice of movements or exercises or mindsets for sort of building resilience moving forward, regardless of sort of what life might throw at you?
Well, I think one of the key things we talked about was play and games. The older we get, the harder it is to do normal exercise. I mean, a lot of people go to an exercise class, or they have a treadmill at home or something like that. I've tried those things, and I find I'm not good at exercising, in a disciplined kind of way. I am good at playing games, whether it's sports like tennis or ping pong, or playing games, physical games, using toys, or juggling. I find circus skills are like games. So my only advice to answer your question is, individually, we have to find out what we enjoy doing physically, and not beat ourselves up if we can't motivate ourselves to take an exercise class. If that's not your thing, that's fine, because it's not my thing either. But find out what you do like to enjoy. There's From my Parkinson's class, there's a group of them that are on a bowling team because they love bowling. And they have a fantastic time with it, even though a lot of them have hard time moving, but they enjoy bowling. So my advice as far as moving as we get older is find out what you have fun doing and just do it.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate your time.
Well, it's been fun talking about this stuff, and having this conversation has reminded me of a lot of the things that I have not focused on this year, since I have not been teaching the class because of the lockdown. So I'm gonna get back to doing some of these things. So I thank you for reminding me about all this.
So, what I really liked about this show is the lesson of people finding something to do that's the message, sort of find something to do that's fun and go ahead and do it. I think that's great advice for everyone. I hope you enjoyed this show, and if you did, you can subscribe via the podcatcher of your choice and maybe leave a review as well. You've been listening to Resilience Radio. Thank you for listening.